In this video, we're going to show you how to replace the oil pan on your Ford Focus. This will be located under the vehicle. Let's get started. Using a 10mm socket, loosen the top nut. Pull the pull out and lift the bracket up. Remove the plastic shield. Remove the bracket. Using a 10mm socket, loosen the negative terminal. Pull the negative terminal off, put it to the side. Using a 10mm socket, loosen the nut for the positive terminal. Remove the positive terminal. Remove the battery. Using a 13mm socket, we're going to remove the 1 bolt and 3 nuts for the battery tray. Remove the battery tray. Remove the 2 8mm bolts for the air box. They will stay captured inside. With the bolts loose, lift straight up and remove the air box. There's 1 grommet in the back. We're going to go after a 13mm nut. Go right under the throttle body. My socket is currently on this. It's right here. I'm using a long extension with a 13mm socket routed under all of these tubes, going straight to the nut. Loosen the nut. When we're loosening this, we only want to go back about 5mm. Any farther than this, and you can risk damage to the transmission. We're loosening our bolts on the transmission side so that we're able to get around this ridge that is on the oil pan. When we're loosening our bolts, we want to get them about this distance out of the hole. There's going to be 1 bolt located right under the EGR valve. Again, I'm going under all of the hoses with a long extension and a 13mm socket. And we're going to loosen this bolt 5mm as well. The last nut we're going to be going after up top is going to be this one right here. This coolant hose you can either pull up or down to get it out of the way. Use a 15mm socket to remove this nut. There should be a T30 bolt that holds in this dipstick bracket. Ours is missing. If you have it, go ahead and remove it. There is 1 plastic clip that is holding the tube to this harness. We're going to pop that clip off of the dipstick tube. Just like so. Remove the dipstick. Put this to the side. Now onto the back side of the motor. Using a 15mm socket or wrench, we're going to remove the nut for this bracket. Remove the nut. Pick up on the bracket and move it out of the way. Under the bracket will be a 13mm nut. We're going to loosen this nut, the 5mm. We're going to loosen the 13mm bolt right under the nut. Again, going to 5mm. Working on the front of the motor on the transmission side, we're going to remove the 13mm bolt 5mm out of the transmission. We have two more 13mm bolts on the bottom of our bell housing. We're going to fully remove these bolts using a 13mm socket. I'm going to break these bolts free and then use an electric tool to remove them. Remove the bottom bolts. Following the dipstick down, you'll find it goes into the pan. We're going to remove this dipstick tube out of the pan. There's an O-ring inside of here. We're going to wiggle and pull straight up. Pop the dipstick out of the tube. I'm going to leave mine rested up there. On the oil pan side, we're going to have two more 13mm bolts going to the bell housing. Remove these bolts. There's one more on the back side. Now we're able to slide the bell housing away from the engine. Using a pry bar, we're going to get in between the transmission and the oil pan, and we're going to separate the two. Go around and split the transmission from the engine, making sure you have that 5mm gap around the whole thing. Using a 10mm socket, we're going to remove the two bolts for the side splash shield. Remove the bolts and the splash shield. Using a 13mm socket, remove the drain plug. Have a drain bucket under you before pulling this plug. Oil will come out. Remove the drain plug and start to drain the oil. Once your oil is done draining, go ahead and reinstall the drain plug. To minimize the mess the oil filter is going to make, I'm going to make a small hole in the bottom of the filter using a little punch and a hammer. Let the oil start to drain. You can do one more hole in this outside. Using a pair of oil filter pliers, loosen the oil filter. You should see it start to drain faster. Spin the oil filter off. Using a clean rag, we're going to wipe all of the oil off of the oil filter housing. Take some new clean engine oil and wipe it on the O-ring of the oil filter, and you can also wipe it onto the threads. Install the oil filter. Get it nice and snug. Use some brake parts cleaner and a clean rag. And clean around the oil filter. Get all the old oil away. Remove the 4 bolts going through the timing cover to the oil pan using an 8mm socket. Remove the 4 bolts. Using a 10mm socket, we're going to go around and remove the 13 bolts for the oil pan. We're going to leave this corner bolt in, just a few threads. Continue around the pan, removing the bolts. This one in the middle of the back, I'm going to leave just a few threads in. The reason I'm leaving some of these bolts partly threaded in, so when we get all of the bolts down and then go to break the pan free, when we break it free, it doesn't just fall and hit you. The bolts will catch it, and then you can easily unthread them and remove the pan safely. Continuing on. Using a pry bar, we're going to get in between the oil pan and the engine block. They have some cutouts so that you're not marring up the mating surface. There's one right here. There's another little one right here, just over here. They're located around the pan. Find one of those spots and gently pry down, breaking the sealer. Do this on the front and the back. Once you have the RTV broken free around the pan, go ahead and remove the 2 bolts that are just threaded in. Pull the oil pan down and remove it from the vehicle. Using a razor blade, we're going to go around and scrape off all the old gasket maker. Be careful while doing this not to mar up the surface. We just want to take off all of the old sealer. Go around the whole pan doing this. Using a clean rag and some parts cleaner, we're going to go around and clean the mating surface for the oil pan. We're going to get any oil residue, dust, or dirt off of the surface. Grab your new oil pan. Using a clean rag and some parts cleaner, we're going to spray it right onto the rag. Then go around the new oil pan, wiping the mating surface. Using gray RTV, we're going to go around the oil pan and put a nice bead. As we're traveling around, we want to put the gasket maker in front of the bolt holes. Go around looking for any thick or low spots and just kind of even them out. On the timing side of the cover, we're going to put one line of silicone. Install the oil pan into place. Get the bolts started by hand. I'm snugging these all the way up to the bottom of the pan, doing 2 on the front side and 1 on the back. Once you have a bolt on each side bottomed out onto the pan, you don't have to hold it up anymore. Go around and continue installing all of the bolts, getting them started by hand. Install the 4 bolts through the timing cover to the oil pan. Get them started by hand and then snug them to the cover. Get the 4 front cover to oil pan bolts snug. These are going to be the first 4 bolts that we tighten for the oil pan. Torque these bolts to 89 inch-pounds. Using a 10mm socket, we're going to go around and torque our oil pan bolts to 18 foot-pounds. Following the sequence I go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. Go around one more time, just double checking. Install the splash shield. Get the bolt holes lined up and install the bolts. Install the bolts through the bell housing to the transmission. Get these started by hand and snugged up to the oil pan. Don't use a wrench or ratchet on it yet. Do the same thing on the other side. Install the 2 bolts going through the transmission to the bell housing. Get these started by hand. Get these bolts started as far as they'll go by hand. We're going to use the bolts on the oil pan side to start to pull the oil pan and transmission back together. Slowly go back and forth on either side, drawing the transmission towards the oil pan. And then swap over to the other side and snug down our bolts going through the transmission to the oil pan. On the front of the motor, we're going to tighten the bell housing to engine bolt. We're going to snug this up as far as it goes. We're going to slowly tighten it down. As we're tightening it down, we're going to alternate between this bolt and the bolt on the rear of the engine. We're going to be snugging down the bolt going from the engine to the bell housing. This is the bolt that we're going to be alternating with on the front. We're just going to go back and forth on these two bolts, pulling the transmission back to the engine. Once you feel it start to get tight, swap to the front one. We're going to slowly tighten it down. After I switch to the front one and made it tight, we're going to come back to the back one, just alternating between the two, getting the transmission snugged up. Once you have both bolts snugged up, we'll torque them to 35 foot-pounds. Snug the two lower bolts to 35 foot-pounds. Torque the pan to bell housing bolts to 35 foot-pounds. Do this front and back. We're going to snug our top bolts now. I'm going to get it in as far by hand as it'll go and then snug it down. Torque this nut to 35 foot-pounds. If you can't get a torque wrench on it, do the best you can. Install the bracket onto the stud. Grab the 15mm nut and get it installed. Snug the nut down onto the bracket. Make sure it's nice and tight. Grab the dipstick tube. Clean off the O-ring and install it into the oil pan. Make sure it's fully seated. Now onto the top of the car, we're going to snug down our top 3 bell housing bolts. Get all 3 of them snugged down. This is the front one. Snug down the bolt right next to it. Using a 15mm socket, we're going to snug down our top bolt. Get the nut nice and snug. Torque the top 3 bell housing bolts to 35 foot-pounds. The one in the back is going to be a 15mm socket. The last 2 bolts are going to be 13mm sockets, torqued to 35 foot-pounds. Install the airbox. Be sure that grommet in the back is sitting down. I'm going to get these bolts started by hand. Snug down the bolts. Install the intake boot. Make sure the boot is fully seated on both the throttle body and the airbox. Snug down the clamps. Install the hose onto the fitting. Push until you hear a click. Give it a pull. Make sure it's locked on. Install the battery tray into the car. Drop it onto the studs. Get the nut started and the 1 bolt. Snug the bolts down. Install the battery. Install the positive cable. Snug the terminal down. Install the negative cable. Snug the terminal down. Install the cover. Install the bracket. Pull the pull out. Install it into the bracket. And snug the nut down. If you have the dipstick tube bolt, go ahead and install that now. Make sure it's nice and tight. Ours is missing. We will not be putting one in. Once the bolt is in, go ahead and install your dipstick. Remove the oil cap. On the cap, you'll find which oil you're supposed to use. For this one, we're going to be using 5W20. Fill the engine to the manufacturer specification. Use a clean rag and wipe up any mess you made. Install the cap. Pull the dipstick all the way out. We're going to clean it off. Reinsert it. Pull it back out. Check the oil level. Be sure that your oil level is in between these 2 dots. The lower dot is the low mark. The high dot is the max fill line. You want your oil to be at this top dot. Once you make sure you have the correct amount of oil, reinsert the dipstick, and you're good to go.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.